Thank you for that introduction, Professor. And thank you all for taking out some time to be here. This afternoon, before the pandemic, I did a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, when they let me, that is. And while it's nice to be back to speaking to students in person, I know better than to take these opportunities for granted. At a time when our colleges and universities seem to be getting more and more intellectually intolerant, it's good to know that we have places like the Ryan Center that understand the role of a college and the purpose of higher education. As some of you may know, a few years ago, the University of Chicago began sending out letters to incoming freshmen that explain the school's commitment to academic freedom, how they don't support trigger warnings or safe spaces or cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial. That used to go without saying on college campuses. Now it needs to be stated explicitly in writing to incoming students, which says something about where we are today. College ought to be a place where students are exposed to different points of view, where their sensibilities are challenged, where they learn to grapple with alternative perspectives and formulate coherent responses, where you learn the difference between a slogan and an argument. On a lot of campuses, that's not happening, or at least it's not happening to the extent that it should be. On a lot of campuses, students are being taught what to think instead of how to think. And they're being encouraged to silence or cancel people they disagree with rather than debate them. All of which makes places like the Ryan Center not only important, but essential in today's environment. And again, I'm very honored to be here. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about the economist Thomas Sowell, someone who's had a huge influence on my journalism, and why so much of his scholarship continues to be relevant to our policy debates today. When I was researching my biography, I kept coming across Sowell's own descriptions of scholars that he admired. And I was often struck by how well those descriptions describe Sowell himself. For example, after the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler, who was one of Tom's professors at the University of Chicago, passed away, Tom wrote this: "In a world of self-promoting academics, George Stigler epitomized a rare integrity as well as a rare intellect. He jumped on no bandwagon, beat no drum for causes, created no personal cult. He did the work of a scholar and a teacher, both superbly, and found that sufficient. If you wanted to learn, and above all, if you wanted to learn how to think, how to avoid the vague words, fuzzy thoughts, maudlin sentiments that cloud over reality, then Stigler was your man." Or here's Tom describing another one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, whom he also studied under at Chicago. Friedman, he said, was one of the few intellectuals with both genius and common sense. He could express himself at the highest analytical levels to his fellow economists in academic publications and still write popular books that could be readily understood by people who knew nothing about economics. I'm hard-pressed to come up with better ways than those to describe Thomas Sowell. When I think about his scholarship, whether the subject is economics, history, culture, race, political philosophy, or what have you, that's what comes to mind: intellectual integrity, analytical rigor, respect for evidence, skepticism toward the kind of fashionable thinking that comes and goes. And then there's the clarity, column after column, book after book, written in plain English for general public consumption. In 2020, at the age of 90, Sowell published book number 36. The title is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I hope Tom's not done writing books, but if he is, you could hardly find a more suitable swan song for a publishing career that has now spanned more than 6 decades. Tom's first 2 books were directed at students of economics, but his third book, the semi-autobiographical Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, was published in 1972 and written for the general public. It grew out of a long article on college admission standards for black students that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine 2 years earlier in 1970, after leaving his teaching post at Cornell. And it begins with a recounting of his own education, first at segregated schools in North Carolina, where he was born, and later at integrated schools in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, where he was raised. The topic of education, both at the K through 12 level and at the college level, is one that he's repeatedly returned to in his books over the decades. In the preface to Charter Schools and Their Enemies, he describes a conversation he had in the early 1970s with Irving Kristol, who was the editor of a quarterly called The Public Interest. When Kristol asked Tom what could be done to create high-quality schools for blacks, Tom replied that such schools already existed and that they had for decades. Kristol asked Tom to write about these schools for his magazine, and a 1974 issue of The Public Interest featured a long essay by Tom on the history of all-black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which had not only outperformed its local white counterparts, the nation's capital, but had repeatedly equaled or exceeded national norms on standardized tests throughout the first half of the 20th century. Over an 85-year span, from 1870 to 1955, Tom wrote, most of Dunbar's graduates went to college, even though most Americans, white or black, did not. 2 years later, in the same publication, he wrote a second article on successful black elementary and high schools located throughout the country. In a sense, today's public charter schools, which often have predominantly low-income black and Hispanic student bodies, are successors to the high-achieving black schools that Sowell researched more than 40 years ago. And as Tom points out, what's clear is that these charter schools are not simply doing a better job than the traditional public schools with the same demographic groups. In many cases, inner-city charter school students are outperforming their peers in the wealthiest and whitest suburban school districts in the country. In New York City, for example, the Success Academy charter schools have effectively closed the achievement gap between black and white students. As Sowell explains, quote, the educational success of these charter schools undermines theories of genetic determinism. It undermines claims of cultural bias in tests. It undermines assertions that black students must be sitting next to white students in order to learn. It undermines the presumption that family income differences explain differences in educational outcomes. This last claim about poverty has been used for decades to absolve traditional public schools of any responsibility for educational failures in low-income minority communities. It's clear that charter schools have such vocal and passionate enemies, not because they don't work, but because they do work. And therefore they pose a threat to the education status quo. They threaten the current power balance that allows the interest of adults who run public education to come before what's best for the children. Bad schools stay open because those schools still provide good jobs for adults. Whether or not children are learning is a secondary concern at best. But as Sowell writes, schools exist for the education of children. Schools do not exist to provide ironclad jobs for teachers. They do not exist to provide billions of dollars in union dues for teachers' unions, or to provide monopolies for educational bureaucracies. And they certainly don't exist to provide captive audiences for indoctrinators. In recent years, charter school skeptics have made headways. Limits have been placed on how many can open, where they can be located. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both supported charter schools, but Democrats and progressives have moved sharply to the left on education more recently. And the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration is far more skeptical of charter schools, all of which makes Sowell's book as timely as anything he's ever written. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this biography is because so much of Tom's scholarship, not just on education, remains relevant to our policy debates today. We're still talking about economic inequality, affirmative action, social justice, critical race theory, slavery reparations, the efficacy of minimum wage laws, the pros and cons of immigration, and on and on. Tom's writings have addressed all of these topics. Frankly, I find it depressing that so many people today know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Ibram Kendi, and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. Sowell's scholarship runs circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, frankly. But it's not just the volume of his writings that surpasses those other individuals. It's also the range and the depth and the rigor of his thinking, of his analysis, which they don't come close to matching. He anticipated many of their arguments decades ago and refuted them decades ago, in some cases before the people making them today were even born. To the extent that Sowell is known, it's mostly for his writings on racial controversies. But most of his books are not on racial themes. And Sowell would have distinguished himself as a first-rate scholar even if he'd never written a single word about race and ethnicity. Another reason I wanted to write the book was to showcase his writings in these other areas. Tom is an economist by training, specializing in the history of economic thought and ideas. But he's also an historian, a sociologist, a political philosopher, and a social theorist. One person described him as one of our great intellectual trespassers, someone unafraid to go wherever his talents take him. Sowell says his favorite book among his own is A Conflict of Visions. And if you want to get inside of Tom's head, it's clearly the book to read. It's a book about the history of ideas. He tries to explain what drives our ideological disputes about freedom, equality, justice, and so forth. And he traces these ideas back at least 2 centuries to thinkers like William Godwin and Immanuel Kant and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, down through John Rawls and the social justice advocates today. The conflicting or contrasting visions he describes in the book are the constrained, or sometimes he calls it the tragic view of human nature, versus the unconstrained or more utopian view. People with a more constrained view of the human condition see mankind as hopelessly flawed. They see inherent limits to human betterment. We may want to end war or poverty or racial discrimination, for example, but that's probably not going to happen. Therefore, our focus should be on putting in place institutions and processes that help us best deal with problems we're probably never going to eradicate entirely. On the other side, you have this more unconstrained or utopian view of human nature, which essentially rejects the idea that there are any limits to what humans can achieve. This is the belief that nothing is unattainable, and moreover, no trade-offs are necessary. Everything is available to all who want it. According to this perspective, through the proper amount of reason and willpower, we can not only manage problems like inequality and racism, but solve them entirely. In A Conflict of Visions, Sowell argues that depending on which view you embrace, there are a whole host of public policies you're likely to support or oppose. The book explains why 2 people, similarly well-informed, similarly well-meaning, will reach opposite conclusions, not just on a given issue, but on a whole range of issues: taxes, rent control, school choice, military spending, judicial activism, and so forth. When Kant said, "From the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can ever be made," he was exhibiting this constrained view. When Rousseau said that man is born free, but everywhere in chains, he was voicing the unconstrained view. When Oliver Wendell Holmes said that his job as a justice was to make sure the game is played according to the rules whether he liked them or not. It was a constrained view of jurisprudence. When Earl Warren said that his job as a justice was to do what he thinks is right, regardless of the law, it was an unconstrained view. This is the philosophical framework, the template, so to speak, that explains Sowell's writings on almost any topic, from economics to migration to education to race and culture. And if you really want to understand where he's coming from, that's the book where he really lays it out. Last year, Sowell was awarded something called the Hayek Prize. It's named after the influential Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. Because of the pandemic, Sowell couldn't travel, and I was asked to accept the award on his behalf. And in my remarks, I said that one of the nice things about Thomas Sowell receiving this year's Hayek Award is that we know with a pretty high degree of certainty that Hayek himself would have approved of the choice. In fact, Hayek might have asked, what took so long? And that's because Sowell was not only a student of Hayek's work, but also an actual student of Professor Hayek in the early 1960s at the University of Chicago. Sowell wrote a paper about the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say for Hayek's class on the history of ideas. And the paper received very high praise from the professor. It was later published in an academic journal. And Hayek would later publicly praise Sowell's 1980 book on social theory, titled Knowledge and Decisions, in the most flattering terms imaginable. Hayek wrote a review of the book for Reason magazine, and my favorite part is the beginning of the review, where Hayek describes how when he first received a copy of the book, he put it aside because he was too busy with his own work to read it. Later, when he finally got around to reading Knowledge and Decisions, Hayek says that he regrets having put it aside because he said he would have made much faster progress on his own research if he had read Tom's book first. Later in the review, Hayek calls Knowledge and Decisions an original achievement that broadened the application of Hayek's own scholarship and, quote, effectively carried the approach into new fields that I had never even considered. Keep in mind that Friedrich Hayek was already Friedrich Hayek when he wrote that. He'd already published A Road to Serfdom, already won his Nobel Prize, was already considered one of the greatest economists of the 20th century. Again, my point is that even if Sowell had never written a single word about affirmative action, his body of work in other areas would be worthy of our attention. Now, beginning in the 1970s, Sowell turned his attention to these racial controversies. He did so, he said, out of a sense of duty, because there were things that needed to be said and too few others who were willing to say them. Tom's criticisms of the direction of the civil rights movement at the time eventually got him canceled, to use today's term. Black elites in particular wanted nothing to do with him because he opposed affirmative action. And they convinced others in the mainstream media not to take Tom's views seriously, not to turn to him for a black point of view on the issues of the day. Sowell has long argued that the problems blacks face today involve far more than what whites have done to them in the past. It's no mystery why black activists want to keep the focus on white racism. It helps them raise money and stay relevant. And it's no mystery why politicians use the same tactics. It helps them win votes. But Sowell argued that it's not at all clear that a laser focus on white racism is helping the black underclass. You can spend all day, every day, pointing out the moral failings of other people, other groups, institutions, society in general. The question is whether doing so actually helps the people who most need help. Many of today's activists go about their business with the assumption that the only real problem facing the black underclass is white racism. A good example of this is the recent focus on policing in black communities. Do racist cops exist? Absolutely. Do some cops abuse their authority? Of course. But are poor Black communities so violent because of racist cops or police brutality? And will reducing police resources improve the situation? According to the Chicago Sun-Times, there were 492 homicides in Chicago in 2019. Do you know how many of them involved the police? 3. 3 out of 492. If Chicago has a policing problem, it's clearly a secondary problem. During one weekend in Chicago a few years ago, 74 people were shot in one weekend. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down, turn away ambulances because it didn't have room for any more bodies. Again, none of these shootings involved cops, not one. Young Black men in Chicago, or Baltimore, or Philadelphia, or St. Louis may indeed leave the house each morning worried about getting shot, but not by a police officer. Will reducing police resources really solve the problem? And more importantly, is that what people who live in high crime neighborhoods really want? Fewer police? Last year, there was a ballot measure put to voters in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed. It would have reduced resources for police, defunded the police department in Minneapolis. Not only was it defeated, it was most strongly opposed by Black residents in high crime areas who want more policing, not less. And Black residents in Minneapolis are not outliers. They're typical. In a Gallup poll released in 2020, 81% of Blacks nationwide said they wanted police presence in their neighborhood to either remain the same or to increase, 81%. Another Gallup poll released a year earlier asked Black and Hispanic residents of low-income neighborhoods in particular about policing. 59% of both Blacks and Hispanics said they wanted police to spend more time in their communities. 59%. In 2015, which is after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, a poll found that a majority of Black respondents said that police treat them fairly. And far more Blacks than whites, by a 2-to-1 margin in fact, said they, quote, want a greater police presence in their local neighborhoods. Nor is this a recent phenomenon. Crime control has been a priority of Blacks for a long time. Way back in 1993, a Gallup poll found that 82% of Black respondents said the criminal justice system doesn't treat criminals harshly enough. 75% of Blacks wanted more cops on the street to combat crime. And 68% said we ought to build more prisons so that longer sentences can be given. Efforts to defund the police are being pushed by activists, liberal elites who claim to be speaking on behalf of low-income minorities. But as the polling shows, they are mostly speaking for themselves. This is something Sowell pointed out a long time ago. In the course of doing research for the book, I went through dozens and dozens of interviews that Sowell had done over the decades. He would often be asked, how does it feel to go against the grain of so many other Blacks? And Sowell would inevitably correct the premise of the question. You don't mean I go against the grain of most Blacks, he would say. You mean I go against the grain of most Black intellectuals, most Black elites. But Black intellectuals don't represent most Blacks, any more than white intellectuals represent most whites. And this continues to be the case today. Most blacks, for example, support voter ID laws and school choice, while most black elites, your academics, your NAACP, your Black Lives Matter activists, are opposed to those things. Conversely, most blacks oppose racial preferences in college admissions, and as I just mentioned, oppose defunding the police, while black elites are in favor of those things. Sowell pointed out these disparities decades ago, and they've only grown since then. His writings on intellectual history have stressed time and again that intellectuals are a special interest group with their own self-serving agenda and priorities, and ought to be understood as such. Liberal elites control the media, by and large. They control academia, by and large. They run the foundations that hand out the intellectual awards and prizes. Sowell has refused to play footsie with them, refused to pull his punches. And it has cost him in terms of prestige and in terms of notoriety. He's paid a price. It's one reason he's not as well known as the individuals I mentioned earlier. I often tell people that if you think Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones represent the views of most black people, you need to get to know more black people. Sowell has been right about this stuff for a very long time. So why does Tom Sowell still matter? Here's why. Sowell is now 91 years old. The book he published last year was not only book number 36, it was his fifth since turning 80. That's not too bad for a black orphan from the Jim Crow South who was born into extreme poverty during the Great Depression, who never finished high school, who didn't earn a college degree until he was 28 years old, and who didn't write his first book until he was 40. But even aside from that impressive personal journey, Sowell is a rare species. He's an honest intellectual. He's someone who has consistently sought out the truth, regardless of whether it made him popular. He's been willing to follow the facts and the evidence wherever they lead, even when they lead to politically incorrect results. It's not something that ought to distinguish you as a scholar, but these days it does. Think about the current debate we're having over critical race theory, which really amounts to a fancy argument for affirmative action. These ideas were once relegated to college seminars. Now they're entering our workplaces through diversity training. And they're entering our elementary schools through the New York Times 1619 Project, headed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which attempts to put the institution of slavery at the center of America's founding. Well, slavery existed for thousands of years in societies all over the world, long before the founding of the United States. More African slaves were sent to the Islamic world than were ever sent to the Americas. Slavery still exists today in places like Sudan and parts of Nigeria. What makes America unique is not slavery, it's emancipation. It's how fast we went from slavery to a Martin Luther King, to a black president. The economic and social progress of black Americans in only a few generations is something historians have described as unmatched in recorded history. That's what distinguishes America. The argument that America became prosperous due to slavery is also unsupported by the facts, as Sowell has pointed out. Individual slave owners certainly prospered, But that's different from saying that the country as a whole benefited. The regions of the country that had slavery were the poorest regions, both during slavery and afterward. And that's true both of the US and of other parts of the world. In Brazil, for example, which again imported far more slaves than America, than the US did, the regions of Brazil where slavery was concentrated were the poorest regions of the country, both during slavery and afterward. And of course, Brazil never became as wealthy as the US. Eastern Europe had slavery far longer than Western Europe. Yet Western Europe has always been richer. Let's also remember, again, that millions more African slaves were sent to North Africa and the Middle East than ever came to the West. If slave labor produces prosperity, why did those regions remain so poor for so long? And later, when the Middle East did start to become wealthier, it wasn't due to slavery. It was due to the discovery of oil beneath the sand. In another 1619 Project essay, the author writes that, quote, "For the most part, Black Americans fought back alone," unquote. This is a breathtakingly ignorant assertion that simply writes out of history the role of the Quakers in the 18th century, the role of abolitionists and radical Republicans in the run-up to the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the role of the NAACP, which was co-founded by whites and blacks together in the early 1900s. It also ignores the role of non-blacks in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which was propelled by alliances with whites, Jews, and Catholics, and others who fought alongside blacks against racial discrimination. But to take issue with the 1619 Project on these grounds is almost beside the point. The whole purpose of the project is to present slavery as an all-purpose explanation for racial inequality today. The argument is that blacks lag in academic performance because of slavery and Jim Crow. They lag in employment because of slavery and Jim Crow. They lag in incomes and home ownership and all the rest because of this awful history. This is part of an ongoing attempt, mostly on the political left, to blame the past actions of whites for the current problems of blacks. Ultimately, it's an attempt to downplay the role of culture and personal responsibility. Blacks are blameless, whites are evil. It's an attempt to push a false narrative. Whites who reject this narrative are labeled as racist. Blacks who reject it are dismissed as dupes or opportunists. These facts about slavery are well known among serious historians. But where are all these serious historians these days? A few have come forward. People like Sean Wilentz, Gordon Wood, and James McPherson come to mind. But why so few? Why isn't the head of every history department at every major university pushing back against the 1619 Project nonsense being peddled by the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and now infiltrating our K-12 school system? The nation's top scholars ought to be falling over one another, denouncing this stuff. Why have they been so relatively quiet? There have been countless books written by serious scholars about our nation's founding. And none of those books have been written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Why are serious historians so afraid to take on a journalist who has never written a book about anything, let alone a book about America's founding or the history of slavery? The reason they are so afraid is because taking her on is politically incorrect. They'll be called racist. They'll be called sexist. It can affect their employment. They could be deplatformed. They could have Twitter mobs coming after them. It might damage their academic careers. This is the sort of intellectual cowardice that makes Sowell's life and work unique. This is what distinguishes his scholarship. Courage. Sowell was never afraid. It's the sort of thing that ought to be commonplace among scholars and intellectuals, and among journalists for that matter. But clearly it is not. Sowell has spent a career putting truth above popularity, and I think we need 100 more just like him. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions, so.
Yep, so I'll have the microphone. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll try to make my way to you. Excuse me. Sorry. Thank you for coming to speak to us today, Mr. Riley. I've been a regular reader of your column in the Journal for years now, since I was in high school. So it's great to see you in person. So you raised the point that Sowell's not necessarily going in his scholarship and his views are not necessarily going against the grain of the vast majority of black people, but really against the grain of black elites and black
based on the polling data that we have.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with the data. I pointed out in class, much to the chagrin of my professors and classmates, all the time. But I've always struggled with, and that I've been trying to figure out myself as I've looked at that data and made that same point myself, is why it doesn't translate as much to the ballot box as you might expect.
That's a good question.
And when there's a ballot measure, say where it's just a question, like with the defunding the police question in Minneapolis, it seems to have translated. But then when you put a politician on the ballot instead, and it gets involved with the party politics, it doesn't seem to translate as well. And I was wondering if you had any additional insight into that.
It's a good question, and I get it quite a bit. But it presumes that black behavior is somehow unique in this regard, and it isn't. There are many groups that seemingly vote against what other people would consider their best interest. And this is pointed out. I mean, one of the old popular sayings about this involved Jewish voting habits, that Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. And it was meant to say, why aren't they voting their pocketbook? Why are they voting for people who are going to raise their taxes? The same could be said about a lot of liberal elites in California and Hollywood who do the same thing. From our point of view or from some other point of view, it's you're not voting your interests. How can you do this? Another example, a concrete example I point out is in 2020, there was a ballot initiative in California about racial preferences in higher education. Back in the mid-90s, California had banned race-conscious college admissions. And this was an effort to reverse that ban. It was defeated overwhelmingly by an even larger margin than what it passed back in the mid-90s. And you know who led the fight against overturning it? Asian Americans. Those same Asian Americans voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So blacks are not unique in choosing certain issues that are going to determine their vote versus what they're going to support in principle or not support in principle. It's been true among other groups as well. I think, frankly, one reason you don't see more blacks voting for more Republicans is that Republican candidates rarely come ask black people for their vote. They don't show up in the neighborhood. They don't go to the barber shops and the community centers and explain their views. They don't advertise on black radio, black Twitter. They largely concede this vote. There are some outliers who have tried this. Larry Hogan did it in Maryland. Chris Christie did it when he was governor of New Jersey. But they remain outliers. By and large, Republicans feel that they can win without this vote, and time spent courting a constituency you're less likely to win over is time not spent courting voters you're much more likely to get. And so until I think Republicans decide they need this vote to win, that's probably not gonna change.
Thank you so much for coming today, Mr. Riley. Appreciated hearing your words. I found them very refreshing. My question is, to what do you attribute the divergence, for lack of a better word, between the data represented that you mentioned about how many blacks are in favor of keeping police resources at the same levels, if not raising them, and the so-called black intellectuals and elites who claim to be representing them, but yet there's clearly a difference in that representation?
Well, you have to look at self-interest. If you're a social activist group, you have different interests at the end of the day than black rank and file. You've got to stay relevant to the discussion. You've got to raise money. From your standpoint, nothing will ever improve for black people. You'll never acknowledge that. You'll be talking yourself out of a job. You'll be talking your organization out of existence. As far as the NAACP is concerned, it is still 1950 in America. And they're never going to concede that basic rights have been won, that basic battles have been fought and won. They have no incentive to concede this. It doesn't help them raise money. It doesn't help them stay relevant to the debate. So I think these groups are acting out of self-interest, by and large. And that's been the case for a long time.
I don't mean to be flip, but what are Herschel Walker's chances in Georgia?
I haven't followed that race very closely. I do know that the Republican Party there is a mess. I mean, they are fighting among themselves like you wouldn't believe, and I know they're not the only state where that's happened in the post-Trump era, if we can call this. I mean, Arizona is in a similar situation. There are a number of states where you have some Republicans who are very loyal to Trump and others who want to move on. And those internal fights could very well cost the Republicans in terms of not having as good a midterm election as they should have based on history.
What is the downside of Herschel Walker? That is why Republicans would not support him.
I think he's got a lot of personal issues, frankly. Things he's said and done in the past that I think can be used against him in a general campaign by his Democratic opponent and don't reflect well on him, just personal conduct. Now, people said that about Trump and it didn't seem to matter, so maybe it won't. What he has going for him is that Georgians love their college football, and he is a god in that state. And so we'll see what prevails.
Hi, Mr. Riley. Thank you so much for coming today. I just had a question about what you had mentioned about Sowell's two views of humanity, the expansive and the constricted view. Does he himself take a position on which one humanity generally falls in?
Oh, sure. He's much more in the constrained view, much more someone who views it. I mean, one of his most famous sayings is that, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And to basically make the perfect the enemy of the good is the wrong way to go. The book, A Conflict of Visions, is actually part of an informal trilogy that he wrote. The other two books are called The Vision of the Anointed and The Quest for Cosmic Justice. The latter two are more polemical because he critiques the various views that he lays out in A Conflict of Visions. In A Conflict of Visions, though, he's just sort of presenting a template. In the latter two books, he delves into what's wrong with one side or the other. And these are not neat categories, that constrained and unconstrained are not substitutes for liberal and conservative or Republican and Democrat. It's not that neat. He's talking about general sensibilities, and there are some overlap in figures that he explains in the books, but it does serve as a useful template if you want to know where he's coming from. But yes, he definitely takes that more tragic view of human nature, and particularly the view that there are trade-offs. So you take something like the minimum wage. If you make the minimum wage and your state or the federal government raises the wage floor, you're better off. Provided you're allowed to keep working the same number of hours. Provided you keep your job. And then you have people who may never get hired in the first place because they've just been priced out of the labor market. And Sowell has argued, if you're going to look at a social policy like the minimum wage, it's not this unalloyed good that one side wants to present it as. There are going to be trade-offs, and he would apply that sort of reasoning and analysis to any number of public policies. But yes, he's not a happy-go-lucky guy.
So in your opening, you talked about, and the phrase is, why is Thomas relevant today? And you talked about the fact that not that many people know his name. I know that's very true. My daughter did a paper on him. No one in the school knew. They had to look him up on Wikipedia to prove whether or not she could do the report. So if Hannah Jones was here, or Kendi was here on this campus, it would be overflowing with kids, right? If Thomas Sowell was here, maybe they could fill this auditorium, maybe. How do we flip that? And the irony is, I would go see both.
Yeah.
They would not go see Thomas. They wouldn't even come to hear him speak.
You're right. That's a good point.
How do we change that? So I applaud the young kids who are here today, but how do we change so they're more in the room? Even if they disagree with them, hear them.
Yeah.
How do we change that?
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book and also narrate the documentary film that I did last year. And one of the nice things about the film is that we could, the producers of the film, because it was not only released on public television channels, you could also stream it on Amazon or YouTube and so forth. And they could collect data on who was streaming it. And one of the nice things was that the numbers tended to trend younger in terms of age and who was interested in it. I'm trying to raise awareness of his ideas. Not because, again, I think he needs some personal cult following, but because those ideas have endured. I think they are just as correct as they were 40 and 50 years ago, and that the Kendis and the Nicole Hannah Joneses continue to bark up the wrong tree in terms of how to address these issues, and where the focus should be. And I think you've got to plug away with facts and evidence and help people appreciate the importance of empiricism and the importance of not just the intentions of a policy, but what actually happens after that policy is put in place. I think too many people on the other side are focused more on intentions, whether what they're doing is well intended and means well, and less on whether it actually works, whether it's been tried in the past and what has happened in the past when it's been tried. I mean, you take something like slavery reparations. At a certain level, slavery reparations amount to another huge wealth redistribution scheme. Gee, we've never tried that before. I mean, why would this one be any more successful than the numerous ones we've tried under the Great Society programs in the past? And so I think you have to have some faith in individuals to maybe do the right thing after all other options have been exhausted. And so I feel like, through my journalism and speaking and book writing and so forth, I can find an audience for these ideas. And one of the nice things is that I think, and what I didn't mention here is that when Sowell was plugging away at this stuff in the 70s in particular, and even well into the 80s, he did not have a lot of company. Today, he has much, much more company than he did back then. So I think his audience has grown. His books sell. If you look at those videos of him on YouTube, they have millions of hits. I mean, they're just views. He is quite, there's in the introduction of my book, I talk about a guy I interviewed who started a Tom Sowell appreciation account on Twitter, a fan account. And all this guy does, he's a millennial from the Midwest. All he does is post quotes from previous Sowell columns and books. He doesn't add anything to the quotes, they're just direct quotes. That account has, I think, around 800,000 followers. This guy's never met Tom Sowell. Tom Sowell's not on social media. But I think it shows that there is an appetite for the types of things he's been writing about and talking about.
You know, Candace is a big follower of Thomas in different books. He talks about truth versus intention. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's what she's doing, people like her, is bringing him back into a more, I don't want to say mainstream, but into a larger audience because they are
I think so. I think so.
In a way.
I think so, and I think, as I write in the biography, that this stuff will endure. One of the things, though Sowell has done a lot to make sure himself that what he's written endures, and that is mainly by being such an accessible scholar and intellectual, such a clear writer. And he got a lot of that, or the importance of that, from mentors like Stigler and Friedman, but Friedman in particular was someone who thought that it was very, very important for intellectuals not to spend all their time simply talking to one another, that they should make a concerted effort to explain what they do to the general public. And in the case of Sowell and Friedman, they both believed that economic literacy was an extremely, extremely important thing in a free market democracy. And like I said, most of Sowell's books are not written for his fellow academics. He did write those books. And that's why I got into someone like Friedrich Hayek's appreciation of those books when he did write them. But most of his books are directed at the general public. And that accessibility, I think, is something that's going to help him endure over the decades. So I think he's really got that going for him as well.
Hi there. Thank you again. Yeah, and thank you for all the questions so far. It's been great. I guess I just have a question. I guess more generally about race in America. I know it's been like the hot topic of conversation. For the past couple of years it seems, And, I think someone like Thomas Sowell, it sounds like, would see that as problematic, that like this overemphasis on race, or this obsession with, having conversations about race in America sometimes. And I know that there are some thinkers that say like this phenomenon has come about like in some ways since the presidency of Barack Obama, and this emphasis on identity politics or hyperpartisanship. And I guess, with that, how much do you see that the presidency of Barack Obama may have contributed to the political climate we're in, and perhaps like the state or the community, the state of like the Black community in America? And, are Black Americans better or worse off in some ways because of Barack Obama having been president?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, it's a complicated question, and I think there'd be a lot to unpack there. I think the symbolism of Obama's presidency was hugely important and a good thing. We can have policy debates over, his agenda as president, whether we should be moving towards, socialized medicine or universal health care, or whether we should be raising taxes or cutting regulation or whatever. Those are fine, but what his presidency represented symbolically, I think, is an overwhelming good for racial progress in this country. And I think was largely celebrated as such. The man is still hugely popular in this country. I mean, again, people distinguish between his policies and his personality, but he's still, I believe, the most popular Democrat in the country. Maybe his wife's more popular than him, I don't know, but he's had that personal appeal. There is data showing that race relations deteriorated during his second term in particular. And I think that coincided with some high-profile police shootings and Obama weighing in on them in a way that made it pretty clear which side he was on, even without knowing all the facts. And if you look at some polling data, by the time he left office, race relations are at their lowest point since, I believe, like the Rodney King riots of the 90s. So now, that certainly continued under Donald Trump, who did nothing to reverse matters on that front. But it didn't start under him. It predates Trump. One of the problems we have here is in the Democratic Party today, and this is something they seem to only be doubling down on in recent years, identity politics continues to be a way for them to get their voters to the polls and win elections. The way I put it is, the left doesn't want a post-racial society. They may give lip service to it, but if you're in favor of racial preferences, you don't want a post-racial society. If you name your organization Black Lives Matter and get mad when people say all lives matter, you don't want a post-racial society. You want the focus to be on race. And so you literally have a major political party who wants to keep race front and center in our national discussions and will turn everything into a debate about race. Will Smith slapping Chris Rock is a racial event? How? But read the commentary on it. Everything is viewed through this racial prism, and that is by design. That is the way one of our major political parties wants it to be. And so it's going to be very hard for us to move on when one side wants blacks to be viewed as blacks, women as women, gay people as gay people, and on and on and on, because that is their way of gaining leverage on their political opponents, who are then painted as racist for not wanting to do that. So I guess it's a long way of saying that we have that Obama's legacy is quite mixed in this sense. But I don't think there's any doubt that his winning election and then winning re-election was a sign of racial progress in this country. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Hi, Mr. Riley. Thanks for coming today. But I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I know you mentioned it earlier, a lot of the inner city violence and also the charter school debate. I'm just wondering if that's kind of like a first step diagnosis when addressing this problem in a lot of the inner cities. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. Absolutely. Our jails and prisons are not only not full of college graduates, they're not full of high school graduates. The correlation between getting a kid through high school and that kid staying out of trouble with the law, staying away from substance abuse, becoming a teenage parent, there are some very, very strong correlations there. And the fact that we continue to relegate Black and Hispanic kids to the worst performing public schools in this country, I think is a travesty. We have education models, namely the charter schools you mentioned, that we know work, particularly among these groups, regardless of their background. And there is a concerted effort to block the scaling up of that model to meet demand. And I think it's a travesty. But I think that's going to be one of the reasons Sowell is so high on educational choice and education in general is because I think he thought it was his ticket in terms of upward mobility and the ticket for so many Blacks of a previous generation. So yes, I'm very big, and it's not that it's got to be charter schools or got to be Catholic schools or got to be vouchers. There have to be alternatives. There has to be school choice writ large to give these low-income parents better options than what they currently have. And for political reasons, they do not have as many options as they should have. We were talking earlier about Black elites acting on behalf of themselves instead of on behalf of the people they claim to represent. The NAACP wants a moratorium on charter schools in this country, even though polls show that Black people overwhelmingly support charter schools. Why? Because the teachers' unions give a ton of money to the NAACP. And the NAACP is doing their bidding. It is as simple as that. And you can point to issue after issue after issue where the priorities of these elites are divorced from the express wants and needs of the people they claim to represent. But education is as good an example as you'll find.
Thank you again, Mr. Riley, for coming and speaking. I guess to bounce off of that question, it seems that the school choice, especially at younger ages, is a primary concern for solving these issues that Sowell has highlighted. Does Sowell, I'm unaware, but does Sowell have a solution? I know he falls into the constrained view as we noted before, but does he have a solution on how to sort of achieve this school choice? I know you mentioned the power that teachers' unions and the elites have in society today, and obviously they are not in favor of this path. Is there a logical or a viable solution towards increasing school choice that Sowell sees? And then I guess once that's accomplished, or if that gets accomplished, what next, I guess?
Well, the solution is ultimately going to be creating a critical mass of beneficiaries of these schools to become advocates for more of them, and then ultimately forcing the hands of the politicians and the policymakers who are in charge of whether more are created. And Sowell as an academic, I'm a journalist, we try and raise awareness about the benefits of these policies, school choice policies. But I'm not an elected official. But what I can do is talk to people about the merits and demerits of these schools. All charter schools are not terrific schools. No one is claiming as much. Some are bad. Some aren't very good. But even there, the bad ones close. They're shut down. Bad traditional public schools can go on for generation after generation, failing children. So the issue is going to be raising awareness about these schools, and that's a full-time job, because you have unions, and I don't, if people, I keep talking about unions and charters, if you don't understand unions' problems with charters, it's because the workforce at most charter schools are not unionized, and therefore unions oppose these schools. You could end the charter school debate tomorrow by announcing that all charter schools will be unionized. Union opposition would disappear like that. They simply want the workforces of these schools unionized and paying dues to their organizations. But yeah, you have to continue to raise awareness. But I think beyond that, I don't see a silver bullet here. One thing, I think during the pandemic, a lot of the union's leadership might have shot themselves in the foot in how they responded to the lockdowns. I mean, we didn't know, there were a lot of X factors about COVID. But we knew pretty early on that children did okay. And yet, due to the abstinence of these union officials, schools were kept closed much, much longer than they needed to be. Learning losses were severe in many communities. Distance learning did not go over well with a lot of these kids. And you had unions using this as leverage for better benefits and higher pay and all the rest. And maybe some people in the public noticed. These school board meetings have gotten quite loud recently. And I think it might have had something to do with the unions overplaying their hand. So there are a lot of different things going on. I'm cautiously optimistic that things are moving in the right direction.
Mr. Riley, may I reframe the earlier question, particularly in your response that awareness is the key here? I think, as a premise, that it can be said that people behave both as consumers and investors. And even if an overwhelming number of consumers like a product or a policy, that doesn't mean they're going to invest in the hard work and invest the heartache and whatnot in order to affect the change. So if the folks that are in charge at the moment structure it so that it's enormously difficult for consumers of education to be investors and try and create charter schools, regardless of their level of awareness, that still doesn't bridge the gap into action.
Well, what school choice does is not simply give parents more options. It also incentivizes traditional public schools to do better so as not to lose their customers. That's what I always liken it to the Postal Service. A lot of you are too young to remember this, but the U.S. Postal Service used to be a lot worse than it is today. A lot worse. And it didn't get better because postal workers got together one day and said, you know what, we're going to clean up our act, just for the hell of it. What happened was UPS. What happened was Federal Express. That's why Postal Service got better. And the same thing is going to happen with public schools. 85% plus of people in this country send their kids to public schools. And most of them are very happy with those schools. We're talking about a minority of public schools that are overwhelmingly attended by low-income disadvantaged groups, and what we can do to improve the situation. My kids go to a public school. It's fine. You know, I have 3 kids. One's in a private school, religious school, and 2 are in public schools. And we're perfectly happy with it. We moved to the neighborhood because we knew the public schools there would be an option. But a lot of these families can't afford to do that. And we're talking about what to do to help those families. And we can do one of 2 things. We can incentivize the public schools they have to attend to improve, or we can give them options to attend better schools that have already shown, proven their models to be successful. But both are important, and I think they work in unison in some sense. It's about competition and the incentives that competition creates in a space.
Thanks, Mr. Riley, for coming today and speaking to us. I had a question on Sowell's perspective from an economist point of view. You described that the left has been like white elites and black elites have been perpetuating a narrative that blames root cause of current problems of black communities on slavery and Jim Crow. Does Sowell acknowledge these root problems as a reason for economic inequality, or is there another root cause, or does he acknowledge it in his writings?
No, there's no denial that slavery and Jim Crow had an impact on black advancement in this country. I don't know anyone who denies that. I don't deny it. Sowell doesn't deny it. The question is the size of that impact and whether those past events, slavery and Jim Crow, legal discrimination, explain entirely or mostly the outcomes we see today. And that's where Sowell diverges from most of the black leadership in this country, which continue to cite slavery and Jim Crow, the history of discrimination, the legacy of those things as the explanation for why black 12th graders today are reading at the level of white 8th graders. And Sowell says, no, I'm not buying that. Something else is going on. And one reason he is so adamant that something else is going on is because of the progress we saw in the first half of the 20th century. During Jim Crow, black incomes growing at faster rates than white incomes, black educational attainment occurring at a faster rate among educational attainment occurring at a faster rate among blacks than among whites, home ownership levels rising. All of this is during a period of legal discrimination, and of course in an era much closer to the institution of slavery. And if you contrast that progress that was occurring with the trends we saw in the post-Great Society period, after this massive government program intervention that we saw under President Lyndon Johnson, when many of those previous trends either stalled or in some cases reversed. Sowell says, what you're seeing today looks a lot more like a legacy of the Great Society than a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And then he will add an international perspective to this because, of course, Black people in America are not the only people on the planet that have been discriminated against. So how have other groups fared, not only here in America, but in other parts of the world that have been hated minority, racial and ethnic groups? Has discrimination prevented their upward mobility? And he'll look at groups like the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, Jews in any number of countries around the world, Asians here in America, Japanese Americans both out-earn and outperform academically white Americans, and have for decades. Notwithstanding the fact that they were lynched, that they were interned during World War II, that they were denied access to certain professions, denied access to land ownership out in California. And they're hardly the only example of this. And so Sowell is saying, yes, slavery and Jim Crow have been a factor in racial disparities in this country, and there is no denying it. The question is that a sufficient explanation for what we're seeing today? Can we just ignore everything else and say everything we're seeing today has to do with slavery and Jim Crow? And he rejects that argument.
One last question.
Take that one step further, and thank you. What would some of the other factors be?
Well, if you look at what was going on in Black America in the first half of the 20th century when we saw these gains, one thing you had were stronger Black families. In every census taken between 1890 and 1940, Black marriage rates in America were either equal to or higher than white marriage rates. As recently as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 Black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father. Today, more than 70% are not. And in some of our inner cities, it's as high as 80 or 85%. If you go back to the first half of the 20th century, you saw much, much lower violent crime rates in Black communities. In fact, and this is a very interesting data point because you, of course, had these great migrations of Blacks, not only from the South to the North, but even more importantly, from rural communities to urban environments. Urban environments usually have wealthier people. There's more money to be made. So that was helpful in and of itself. Physically moving yourself was helpful. Doing the same job in Cleveland that you were doing in Mobile, Alabama is going to pay more in Cleveland, even if it's the exact same job. So simply moving was a boon for Blacks. But in terms of violent crime rates, in the 1940s, the Black homicide rate for men fell by 19%. And in the 1950s, it fell by another 21%, which is interesting because, again, this is a time when Blacks are moving from rural environments to urban environments, and urban environments are typically more violent. They still are today. Yet, the violent crime rates among Blacks were falling during this period, while remaining relatively flat among whites. I point this out and make a big deal out of this because you see stronger Black nuclear families, you see lower violent crime, and both of those things are quite conducive to upward mobility. And that is what we were seeing. What we see today are broken families, lawlessness, and horrible schools. You take away the family, you take away law enforcement, you take away schools, there is nothing left. There's nothing left. And we're seeing the result of that. So a lot of what was going on in the first half of the 20th century was simply conducive to upward mobility, not just for blacks, but for a lot of other groups as well. I mean, the other thing I'd point out is economists have shown, and these are economists and political scientists on both the left and the right, they are in agreement on what I'm about to say. The fastest growth, the period of the fastest growth among blacks in this country since the end of slavery occurred between the late 1940s and the early 1970s. This was post-war America. The economy was humming. Labor markets were extremely tight. Jobs were plentiful. And to use the cliche, they were lifting all boats. They were lifting black boats higher, at a higher rate than they were lifting white boats at the time. Which tells me that what the black underclass needs, more than wealth redistribution schemes, more than affirmative action, none of which was available during the period of the fastest growth for blacks in this country. What they need much more than those two things are tight labor markets. And when they've had them, we've seen the result, which is black upward mobility. So it's a very understudied and underappreciated period of black history. I understand why that is. As I was saying earlier, if you are a civil rights organization or a black activist group, it is not in your interest to focus on anything that doesn't have to do with racial discrimination as a barrier to black progress. And pointing out what I just pointed out would take the eye off the ball, so to speak. And they don't want to do that. But there were a lot of things going on during that period that I think are worthy of attention by policymakers today. Because what it means is we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We know what works because it's worked in the past. And it's about re-educating the public about this and our policymakers about this. And that's a heavy lift, but I think it can be done. I'm an optimist, more so than Sowell. But in any case, thank you all and good luck on Saturday.